The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's Thought Leaders Webinar Series, a webinar series featuring military leaders and contemporary military authors. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Executive Vice President, General Bob Brown.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Thought Leaders Webinar Series. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. While we wish we could all be together at AUSA, that's not currently possible. So we've crafted a series of events to bring you senior Army leaders, authors, and others speaking on topics of current interest to America's Army, all in a live, interactive forum. We're very glad you've joined us today and appreciate your support as partners in the defense of our nation. Joining us today is Dr. James Helis, Director, Army Resilience Directorate. Dr. Helis will discuss the Army's efforts to continuously improve sexual assault, sexual harassment, and associated retaliation prevention efforts. He will explain how to eliminating sexual offenses promotes cohesion and ensures the readiness of Army formations. Dr. Helis will discuss how the Army ensures professional, compassionate, and comprehensive care and support to members of the Army team when sexual harassment or sexual assault incidents do occur. For those of you joining us online today, please take advantage of having Dr. Helis here to ask questions. You can use the question and answer tab on the right side of your screen to submit a question. After the discussion, we will take as many questions as possible. A little bit about Dr. Helis. He was appointed to the Senior Executive Service in July of 2012. As the current director of the Army Resilience Directorate, he establishes effective strategies, develops plans, and formulates policies for continued improvement of the Army's resilience, sexual harassment, assault response and prevention, Army suicide prevention, and Army substance abuse prevention programs. Dr. Helis works with Army and Department of Defense senior leaders to develop and execute short-term strategies and long-term initiatives to satisfy changing needs in a dynamic, evolving, supporting environment, supporting soldiers and Army families. And prior to this assignment, he served as a National Security Counselor to the Assistant Secretary for Aviation and International Affairs, Office of the Secretary of Transportation in Washington, D.C. Additionally, Dr. Helis served as a superintendent to the United States Merchant Marine Academy for 6 years. Welcome and thanks for joining us today. Dr. Helis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, sir. It's an honor to be here this afternoon to discuss this important topic with those who are interested and concerned with America's Army. Sexual assault, sexual harassment are absolutely intolerable behaviors. They violate our Army's deepest core values. They undermine readiness, they undermine cohesion in teams, and they hurt soldiers, they hurt units, they hurt families. I've personally witnessed and seen this and understand how the violation of trust that occurs when you have a case of sexual assault or sexual harassment is just absolutely destructive to our units. We've been working at eliminating sexual assault, sexual harassment in the Army for quite some time. And candidly, we are just not where we want to be, need to be, or should be with the program. The Fort Hood Independent Review, which was released last fall, caused us to take a hard look in the mirror at ourselves and our programs. And a couple of the findings, what it really boiled down to is that we had lost sight of taking care of soldiers. There was a lack of attention and priority on the well-being and safety of our soldiers. There was a lack of leadership engagement and support for the program, especially as you move down the chain of command to lower echelons. And while the Secretary's independent review only looked at Fort Hood, Texas, the reality is we believe that these conditions are present to greater or lesser degrees at other installations across the Army. The challenges that Fort Hood faced were not unique to Fort Hood. There are some issues environmentally with Fort Hood, but in particular, we have to look at the Army And our focus on readiness, the high op tempo, and how that was interfering with the ability of our leaders, especially our junior leaders, to be meaningfully engaged with their soldiers and with their families. To talk about some of the actions that we have taken as an Army. Prior to Fort Hood, the Fort Hood Independent Review, if we go back to 2018, 2019, for a number of years we had seen the prevalence, the rates of sexual assault declining in the Army. And then in 2018, the every other year survey of the active force showed that we had seen a significant increase in the prevalence of sexual assault perpetrated against women in the Army. And so at that point, we began to take steps that we needed to readdress the problem and to look more at how we would be preventing sexual assault. Some of the steps we've taken. Emerging out of the Talent Management Task Force was a command assessment program that we piloted in early 2020 and is now in place full-time for leadership at brigade and battalion command teams. After the selection board process, the selectees go to Fort Knox, Kentucky for about 3 days of a variety of assessments to determine if these leaders have the understanding, the empathy, the communication skills, and the commitment, the ability to truly connect with their soldiers, to build climates of dignity and respect, to build cohesive teams where people are prioritized. And again, that has been underway since 2020. We began a review of how we staff the SHARP program. Some of the issues identified at Fort Hood that we had identified earlier was an over-reliance on borrowed military manpower, that we had insufficient requirements to meet the needs of commanders and leaders in implementing the SHARP program, and that we had to take a hard look at where we actually had our SHARP professionals positioned across the force. So we had undertaken that effort. Again, following the 2018 report showing that sexual assault had increased across all branches of the service, the Department of Defense initiated the Prevention Plan of Action, which is a comprehensive DoD-wide program to look at prevention of sexual assault in the force, to move upstream of it, to move from the focus which we'd had, which was mostly on bystander intervention in the early stages, as you're getting closer to a sexual assault, began to moving far upstream, moving left on the timeline to create the conditions where sexual assaults are not going to be tolerated within a command, and where soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Guardians are all treated with the dignity and respect that they deserve. The Army undertook This Is My Squad in 2019 as well. Again, with squad not being a tactical organization, but those around you with whom you immediately work, and how we build climates and cultures and how leaders build climates and teams where everybody is valued, everybody is treated with dignity and respect, and are allowed to arise to their full potential. And in that kind of a climate, we think that these kinds of behaviors, sexual assault, sexual harassment, other destructive behaviors, will eventually begin to drop as we recognize the value of each team member, and we treat team members with dignity and respect, and we live the Army values and expect ourselves to live to them. Since the release of the Fort Hood report in late 2020, the Army has formally made people the #1 priority. We talk often that people are our most important asset, that they are more important than any platform or system that we have in place, because without the people, the systems don't operate, the platforms don't function. And we have explicitly formally made people our #1 priority. The leadership at Headquarters Department of the Army and below has taken deliberate steps to try to reduce op tempo, to create time and space for leaders, particularly junior leaders, our junior non-commissioned officers, to meaningfully connect with and engage with their soldiers, to know their soldiers, to be able to build the climate and the cohesive teams we need at those levels, both for war fighting and for taking care of people. The Secretary of the Army established the People First Task Force, which is going to address the entire range of issues in terms of taking care of people. The first two priorities that the PFTF is tackling are a relook at the sexual harassment assault response and prevention program, basically going back to square one with starting with the mission analysis of what are the core requirements of a program and building options and ways that we can improve that program moving forward. They're also looking at what I would call comprehensive prevention. How do we, as an institution, as an Army, get about preventing those harmful behaviors that undermine cohesion and undermine readiness and hurt soldiers? In parallel, the Secretary of Defense has launched his independent review commission looking at sexual assault, sexual harassment across the force. That DoD-wide review is looking at 4 lines of effort: accountability, prevention, climate and culture, and victim care. All of the services are actively engaged. The Army is actively engaged in this process. It's working on a very aggressive, tight timeline with intent for recommendations to go to the Secretary of Defense and the President within 90 days. So we're looking at sometime in June for that. These are mutually reinforcing efforts. They're not exclusive. We are cross-talking between the Army representatives in the IRC and those in the People First Task Force to synchronize these efforts and so that these efforts can be self-informing. Again, I would emphasize that these issues are of utmost importance to leadership across the Army, that we have to eliminate these behaviors. They are violative of our values, they hurt soldiers, and they undermine cohesion and readiness. We're committed to eliminating sexual assault and sexual harassment from our ranks. And I think with that, again, I want to thank AUSA for inviting me for this conversation. This is an extremely important topic. I want to give a shout out to all of the professionals who are engaged in this effort in the Army Resilience Directorate at Echelon across the Army, at the Army Public Health Center who are supportive of these efforts, dedicated professionals who come to work every day trying to figure out how can we better help, better serve, better take care of our soldiers. And with that, I look forward to the conversation for the rest of the time.
Dr. Helis, that's a great rundown, and thanks for going through that. Very comprehensive. You know, it's so important you're here, especially this is April is DoD's Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month, and so we're so glad to have you now here now with this key topic. You know, as we look, questions are starting to come in, and we'll get to all those. Again, I would encourage you just go to the question and answer tab. Let me get one of the first questions. What steps has the Army taken to implement restricted or confidential reporting for sexual harassment? I know that's an area of concern to a lot of folks. What steps has the Army taken in that area?
The idea of restricted reporting for sexual harassment is in parallel to the concept that we have unrestricted and restricted reporting already in place for sexual assault. An unrestricted report is immediately forwarded to CID for a full investigation of the offense. A restricted report does not go to the chain of command, does not go to investigation, but it allows the victim to first establish a record in case they decide to unrestrict the report and pursue investigation later. And it principally allows the victim access to support services, medical, behavioral health, counseling, and so on, as they begin their healing and their recovery. And the question has come up, should we have a similar restricted reporting process for sexual harassment? It's one of the recommendations from the Fort Hood report. The People First Task Force is looking at all of the recommendations from the Fort Hood report. I can say that now, today, and for many years, the Army has had an anonymous reporting process within sexual harassment, where a victim can present the report anonymously to the unit sexual assault response coordinator, who also handles the sexual harassment reporting. That report remains anonymous. It remains between the SARC and the victim, but the content of the report without the names is provided to the commander, and if there is sufficient evidence in the restricted or the confidential report, the commander can then take action and take initiatives on that.
And that's a great rundown, and I know it is a concern. You know, the topic often comes up with commanders of, you know, you would want the chain of command to certainly to solve and get involved, but there may be some soldiers that aren't comfortable that should have the opportunity to have a more confidential way to report, so that you feel pretty confident that's already addressed, but they'll look at it even more as they look at the system.
We're looking specifically at all of the recommendations from the Fort Hood report, and that was one of them. I would also want to note that for all issues that face soldiers, chaplains are available as an absolute confidential source. It's
That's
not a report,
point.
okay, because a chaplain is not going to take it and do anything with it, but a chaplain is somebody that a soldier can turn to for request for support, for assistance with any matter, and be guaranteed absolute confidentiality in that conversation and in that relationship.
We have a question came in from Ralph. Talks about, what is the average length of time to conclude a sexual harassment assault complaints? And he goes on, he explains that he's seen it take, in some cases, even almost 4 years in a unit he was in. What is it now, and are there any actions being taken about the length of time of a report?
With a sexual harassment report, there are specific timelines that are set up in the regulation that require a prompt investigation upon report and a completion of the investigation normally within 30 days. The investigating officer can, of course, ask for extension on that if the case becomes too complicated, if there become more witnesses, more incidents. But typically, a sexual harassment case with the 15-6 formal investigation can be resolved fairly quickly. With sexual assault cases, those are much more complicated. Those are criminal investigations. These are complex criminal investigations that would involve interviewing witnesses for context, reviewing of electronic, personal electronic devices for potential evidence in a case, and those can in fact take longer. I wouldn't want to pin a particular time to it. I can tell you from engagements with CID, from personal visit to the CID lab down at the Gillum Enclave outside of Atlanta, that they take these cases extremely seriously. They try to process the evidence as rapidly as possible, but sometimes it is just takes time, much longer than we want. Part of the Fort Hood recommendation was to look at investigative processes. I know that Major General Donna Martin and the Acting Undersecretary of the Army are looking specifically at the recommendations for CID and how we can improve and expedite the investigations process.
Thanks, great answer. And Emily submitted a question. What's being done to address the culture of harassment which leads to assaults? A great question.
It is a great question, Emily, and you get at the core of the matter that this is about our Army values and about treating each other with dignity and respect. Nobody should be harassed or bullied or hazed in person, online, or in groups. And This Is My Squad is intended to focus on building cohesive teams and the importance of junior leaders building that team, understanding setting expectations and standards, and enforcing those standards at the lowest level. So it becomes, as soon as you hear a comment that is sexist or has an inappropriate tone to it, as a leader, you've got to step up and say something. Mm-hmm. Or if somebody in the group says something, as a leader, jumps in before you do, that you reinforce that peer accountability. So it's addressed. Principally, I think the principal way we're going to address this over time is going to be through engaged leadership that in all ways, every day, enforces the Army values on an ongoing basis. We have been working with the NCO Education Center of Excellence down at Fort Bliss to work with and working with the Sharp Academy at Fort Leavenworth on how we improve leader education in how we prevent sexual assault and sexual harassment and build that climate. We've already made substantial changes in the pre-command course. Those were kicked off in January and February, where more time is given to prevention of sexual assault and sexual harassment and building climate. And we're going to continue to improve those efforts in the leader development program.
Another question in an area that's I've heard a lot of talk about over the last couple of years comes in from Guy. It says there are efforts on Capitol Hill and elsewhere to remove commanders from the disciplinary process associated with sexual assault and similar crimes. Wouldn't that undermine the responsibilities of commanders to care for the well-being of their soldiers?
Yeah, commanders are absolutely responsible for taking care of the well-being of their soldiers. They're also responsible for maintaining good order and discipline within the organization. And that involves setting standards, making sure the standards are clearly understood, and then enforcing the standards with the tools that the commander has available, whether those are administrative disciplinary tools or through the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So I dealt with sexual assault cases as a battalion commander at Fort Jackson a long time ago, before it was taken up to brigade commanders. I felt that was my responsibility. I owed it to my soldiers to make sure that allegations of misconduct were investigated. We went where the evidence took us, and we held perpetrators accountable. We provided justice for those soldiers. So I think commanders still play a crucial role in the administration of just military discipline and military justice in their formations.
You would certainly worry about commanders being taken out of the loop, and possibly the emphasis isn't there that we need on prevention, education, and then obviously a response when there is a situation.
The Secretary of Defense has talked about, has made clear that we're not foreclosing any options at this point going forward as to how we might make modifications to the system so that we better hold perpetrators accountable. That's one of the 4 lines of effort within within his independent review commission. The service JAGs, the military criminal investigating organizations are providing advice to that LOE. So we are having that the message about the importance of the role of commanders in discipline. And I certainly think even if we were to go to some form of an independent process, I still think commanders would play an important role, and commanders have to be engaged in that process.
Question from Janet, and a really great one. Thanks again for the great questions coming in. With a soldier rotating units every 2 to 3 years, is there a system to allow sexual harassment allegations to follow that soldier? Too often soldiers just have to wait out leadership to change, and then they have a new slate.
Janet, that is a great question. One of the items that it was being looked at within the People First Task Force is how we can create a record where if a soldier has been has committed an offense of sexual harassment and it's been administratively dealt with, the soldier remains in service, but there's discipline or there's a record, that record would be available to future commanders. So if the soldier repeats the offense, then we would have a way to say, okay, you're a repeat offender, you're not learning, and you therefore have no place in our Army. So that is one of the recommendations out of Fort Hood, and we are looking at that within the PFTF.
Great. David asks, how do the current timeline trends of military prosecution compare to similar civilian prosecution timelines? Are additional resources and policies required to make military prosecution timelines more efficient?
Yeah, great question, David. I think it's a little bit of apples and oranges to try to compare civilian investigation and prosecution of these cases with military investigation and prosecutions. We have different legal constructs for both. There are different processes for both. Certainly, we are actively looking at ways that we can make the process more effective. But what's important is we want to get it right. We want to make sure that we do investigate the cases thoroughly, that we do get to the right answers, and that we are able to provide justice for victims. So again, I would be careful about saying we want to look at a timeline and how fast does New York City do it or how fast does Seattle, Washington do it as compared to how fast it would occur, say, at Joint Base Lewis McChord. I think that's a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison, but we are looking at how we improve it. Things we have done, we have criminal investigators who are trained in investigating sexual assaults and in trauma-informed investigation. We have specially trained attorneys who serve, JAG officers who serve as prosecutors for these cases and advisors to CID for it. We have specially trained attorneys who act as special victim counsel, who provide the victim legal advice and keep them advised on how the process works. And we provide the training, of course, to commanders in the pre-command course as to their roles and responsibilities in the UCMJ process, particularly for sexual harassment and sexual assault.
Another great question from Scott says, what are you doing to address cultural issues? For example, dismissal of the seriousness of an issue, and how are you combating training fatigue and cynicism?
Yes, Scott, those are a couple of great questions. The seriousness of the issue, is something that is being reinforced by leadership at echelon, and I don't think that anybody can sit and think that this is not a serious issue from within the Army. It was the Secretary of Defense's first directive to the force. It is a top priority for Chief of Staff of the Army. When he talks about eliminating destructive behaviors that undermine readiness and hurt soldiers, sexual assault and sexual harassment are at the top of that list. The Sergeant Major of the Army in his engagements is making clear to non-commissioned officers that these behaviors can't be tolerated, and that we have to make changes in the culture and the climate of our formations to ensure that these behaviors are taken seriously, they are not accepted, and when allegations come up, they are properly reported, properly investigated, and that perpetrators are held accountable. Training fatigue is a challenge. Understand that. Unique to the other services, we have a SHARP Academy at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which is responsible for developing the training materials for the force. We are constantly looking at how do we refresh, how do we revise those materials to try to make them more current, to try to make them more interesting. Recently, as part of the People First Task Force process, the Army convened a solarium at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, where we brought in junior soldiers, junior officers, less than 2 years in service, and asked for their viewpoints on the range of destructive behaviors. And one topic that we sought their input on is how can we make training more interesting to you, to connect better with you, to be more effective. So we are trying to get at the issue of training fatigue and also the effectiveness of training.
That's great. Now there's another question that's really good. How the Army is addressing the structural flaws in its SHARP program. Some of those came out in the Fort Hood report, other reviews, and namely that, SHARP military professionals are assigned via borrowed military manpower, and the assignment does not present the same benefits as other career broadening opportunities.
Again, this was a process that we'd begun looking at before Fort Hood about how we would generate the right requirements in the right places to meet the needs of leaders so that we could move away from borrowed military manpower and have the proper authorizations and requirements in place for SHARP professionals, both uniformed and civilian, across the force. We had developed some initial recommendations at about the time that the Fort Hood report was coming out. We have folded those in to the work of the People First Task Force as they examine the specific recommendations. But we do need to make sure that we are picking the right people, that first we have the right positions and requirements identified, we are choosing the right people for it, and that we provide the proper support and recognition for those professionals who choose to take on what is extraordinarily difficult and challenging and critical work for our Army.
Mary asked, could a service member choose to report a sexual assault that occurred on base to civilian authorities?
Mary, that's a great question. Yes, a service member could report a sexual assault to civilian authorities. A service member could access a local rape crisis center or similar facility. The question that local law enforcement would be faced with is, would they have any jurisdiction over a crime that took place on the installation? And unlikely in a federal installation that they're going to have that jurisdiction. But yes, you can report it. The other that I would point out is that if you report it to Sexual Assault Response Coordinator, a restricted report remains essentially confidential between the victim and the SARC and those people who are involved in the care for the SARC and for the victim. An unrestricted report remains confidential to the extent that we can, commensurate with conducting a full and comprehensive investigation of the report. There would not necessarily be those assurances if you took a report of sexual assault and took it to a local law enforcement authority.
Another question you mentioned from William. You mentioned This Is My Squad program. Is there anything concerning sexual harassment, sexual assault being discussed in basic training and officer training schools?
Yeah, another great question. We introduce sexual assault and sexual harassment in basic training, It's one of the first subjects. It's an early subject in the curriculum for soldiers, where they're introduced to what are the standards, what are the rules, what are the expectations, and what, from an Army perspective, broadly are the reporting requirements and options, and what the resources are. We also talk to relationships in basic training and the concept of consent. And then, of course, the training continues progressively through AIT and then out into the units as they receive refresher training. Sexual assault and sexual harassment training is also part of our pre-commissioning programs. It's taught within our OTC. It is part of the curriculum of the Officer Candidate School, and it's certainly part of the curriculum at the U.S. Military Academy. So we introduce sexual assault, sexual harassment, our standards, our expectations, prevention, and response mechanisms as soon as somebody enters the training system for the Army, either basic training or in a pre-commissioning program.
We continue to get really good questions. We may have a record here for
that's great,
number of
because
questions, which is
subject.
great. Dr. Helis, thanks for taking on. I'm firing them at you quick, but I want to get to all we can because these are really good questions in such an important area. There's talk, Philip asks, is there talk about revamping the annual SHARP training? You touched on this a little bit earlier, possibly including victim stories and how the current available resources have helped them. Something to separate the SHARP training from the average, PowerPoint type presentation. You addressed a little bit of that, but
every year the SHARP Academy revises the training support packages. The policy in the Army now is that SHARP training is conducted by unit leaders. It is led by unit leaders, supported by the unit SHARP professionals who can be there to provide specialized expertise. It is conducted at least annually, and the time, the location, the duration is all left at the discretion of unit commanders. The training is to be face-to-face, and every year the SHARP Academy looks to revise the training to improve it. I just reviewed the draft package for the next revision. There is absolutely no PowerPoint in that training support package that we hope to be published in the next couple of months. It does provide, has always provided vignettes for here are, based on real stories and real incidents of sexual assault that can be used by the leaders conducting the training to talk about what is a sexual assault like and to generate discussion of what would you do in this situation? How would you respond to this? If formations have victims who are willing to come forward and talk about their experiences, those are indeed very powerful training events. There are installations and commands where that happens. Realistically, we have to accept that not every formation, not every command is going to be able to have a victim who they know about or who would be willing to stand up in front of a group of soldiers and share those experiences, but those are certainly powerful and have been used by leaders across the Army.
Great, that's great to see. Troy asked, he says, unfortunately, there are those who make false reports on sexual assault or harassment. What steps has the Army taken to mitigate false reporting?
Yeah, I think one of the myths that surrounds sexual assault and sexual harassment is the number of false reports. There are extraordinarily few false reports of sexual assault or sexual harassment. And in fact, if the CID investigation determines that it is a false report, that soldier who made that report is subject to action under the UCMJ for false reporting. But the reality is that when we look at the numbers of reports that CID looks at in investigations, it is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of cases that are determined to be false reports. It is much more likely, orders of magnitude more likely, that victims do not report a case of sexual assault or sexual harassment for a variety of reasons. They're afraid of reporting it. They fear reprisal. They fear that they're not going to be believed. They fear that people think that they're making this up. And we need to dispel that myth. It is extraordinarily rare that we see a case where there is actually a false report of sexual assault or sexual harassment. Soldiers are truthful. And the same applies when we look at research done in the civilian world. Victims are truthful. People do not make up these reports. It happens, but it is extraordinarily rare.
Lauren asks, what associations between behavioral health issues and sexual assault have been established? What actionable steps are being taken to combat this, to put people first?
Lauren, that's a great question. Sexual assault is a traumatic event, and it's traumatic for the victim, and it becomes traumatic for those around them, for their friends, their family, their battle buddies. When you learn what has happened to somebody, when you engage and you sit down with a victim of a sexual assault and you hear their story and you see the effect it's had on them, these are moments that I will never forget, that are burned into my memory of sitting down and talking to and working with victims of sexual assault. So we understand that. So the first is there is a restricted reporting option, again, which gets them availability of services, which includes behavioral health and counseling to assist them with the trauma of a sexual assault. We have to do a better job, I think, educating the force of just how traumatic sexual assault is. It's not a, hey, this was no big deal, or I didn't mean anything by it. This is a violation of a person's dignity, of their personhood. And again, this is whether we're talking about a penetrative or a non-penetrative offense. It is terribly traumatic. And Lauren, thanks for bringing that point up. And it is important, and I would again encourage anybody who is a victim to call the helpline, to seek out the help you need so you can begin the healing process from that trauma.
Michael asks, if there's been any thought or discussion in making sharp professionals like victims advocates or SARCs into a new MOS that can only be joined after a certain time and grade, time and service or rank, and to separate it from an additional duty level of focus and into something that shows how important it actually is.
Yeah, Michael, that's a great question. One of the recommendations in the Fort Hood report was that sexual assault, sexual harassment positions no longer be performed as collateral duty positions. Presently in the Army at brigade and above, these are full-time positions for both military and civilian personnel, but below the brigade level, these are collateral duties. And that's one of the recommendations, is to eliminate these as collateral duty positions. And we're looking very, very hard at that. We also had started looking before the Fort Hood report and continuing to explore ways that we can provide the appropriate recognition for those engaged in this business, that their selection processes be akin to those that we look at for equal opportunity or inspector general type positions, where they're very, very selective screening qualifications, and that we provide greater recognition to it. There are already rank requirements and time and service requirements in place. You have to, be a non-commissioned officer with a certain number of levels of service for different levels in the sexual assault program. But again, we are looking at how we continue to emphasize the importance of these positions and continue to better recognize the contributions of soldiers and civilians in those jobs.
Joan asks, what plan will you have in place to rotate out civilian victim advocates to prevent burnout and compassion fatigue? She says civilian personnel tend to stay in one assignment for too long, shunning adaptation to a constantly developing SHARP program.
Great question, Joan. And when you talk about compassion fatigue, for those out there who work with victims on a daily basis as a large component of their job, there is a degree of burnout. You take these cases home with you. They're not things that you can really discuss with others, particularly if you're dealing in restricted reporting. And so what we are looking at in the civilian side is creating a career ladder, if you will, a variety of positions that are specifically going to be coded for sexual assault, sexual harassment professionals, so that there would be opportunities both for upward and lateral mobility, so that they could move from direct victim care into staff, program management, program analyst type positions, to give them a break from the victim care, and so that they can take their experiences and feed them into our program management, program design and training design, and then perhaps at a future date they could rotate back directly into victim care.
A great question, an area that I know is of concern. A sharp professional out there says, a frustration of mine over the last several years is a struggle to easily find and reference current doctrine driving the SHARP program without combing through old guidance issued to the field. He says, in my opinion, there are too many ALARACs, XORs, memorandums, NDAs, et cetera, and some documents contradict others. Would it be possible to make a go-to website that has all the current doctrine in one location?
Yeah, a great question, and we recognize the challenges with all of the changes in the program that come from legislative changes, that come from directives from OSD, that come out of HQDA, and that may emanate at lower echelons in the program, and how that can create confusion. One step we took last summer, the Army republished FM 600-20 command policy, which is where SHARP policy and regulation are embedded. And that superseded as many of the ALARACs, XORs, and other directives that had been issued prior to the summer of 2020. So that was a first step, was to catch up on all of that. A second step that we're working is the creation of a separate SHARP regulation. So there would be a single reference source both for SHARP professionals, leaders, soldiers to turn to. That is in what I would call near final draft form right now. And it would be extracted from 620, published as a separate document. One thing we're looking at right now is in consideration of the timing of that, given the work of the People First Task Force, given the work of the Secretary of Defense's independent review, should we delay this a little bit longer to make sure that it is as current as possible, that in 3 months, 6 months, we don't have to push out a whole new set of changes. And so we're having those discussions now as to how do we balance between getting the separate SHARP regulation published to the field, and how do we not put it out to almost immediately turn around and incorporate changes to policy that may emanate from the IRC or from our own work inside the Army with the People First Task Force.
Patricia asks, how do you address the situation when Sergeant X, who's perceived as a unit's best soldier, is also a harasser? The commander doesn't see it and doesn't believe it could be true.
Yeah, Patricia, you make a great point. Often it's difficult to for us to get our arms around the notion of a soldier somebody who in many ways performs well, can also be committing egregious behaviors, sexual assault, sexual harassment, bullying, cyberbullying, in any of these behaviors that we can associate. Here's this individual with this record. How could they be guilty of these offenses? And that is something a perception that we all have to overcome. We have to also remember that, look at the victim of this. This is a soldier who's working hard, who has volunteered to serve his or her country, to put their life on the line, and they're not going to make these allegations against a fellow soldier lightly. Commanders have to understand the first thing you need to do is believe the report, and take the proper steps that are required by law and regulation to investigate the allegation and to investigate it thoroughly. And it's fairly straightforward. You know, the requirements for if there's a report, a formal report of sexual harassment, or an unrestricted report of a sexual assault, that they must be formally investigated. That's not an option. Commanders need to understand that, and they have an obligation to go where the evidence takes you. And I can say from being in that position, I have gone where the evidence takes me and say, I cannot believe that this person did this, but the evidence is there. It's clear. And so as a commander, as a leader, I have to hold that person accountable. I have to take care of that soldier. So I would tell you that you need to dispel the illusion that just because somebody is a good soldier in many ways does not mean they cannot be someone who is committing egregious behavior. And commanders need to listen to victims, to understand what they're saying, and to properly investigate and to go where the evidence takes you, however difficult or uncomfortable that might be. That's your responsibility as a commander and a leader.
A last question from Mark, and it's a really good one that will help folks out there, I believe. What everyday actions do you recommend that junior soldiers can take, that they can take on to combat sexual harassment, sexual assault, even when they may not see the problem themselves?
Mark, that is a great question, and that gets right down to the crux of Tim's, of This Is My Squad, of building cohesive teams at the squad level, up at all levels of the Army, where every member of the team is treated with dignity and respect. Every member of the team is valued for their contribution. Everybody understands that everybody has to be running at 100%, because if we have to go down range, then we need everybody at the top level of their game. And so how do you do that? I would say one is you set high standards. And the first moment that you see somebody who's giving anything indicative of inappropriate behavior, an off comment, the inappropriate picture on the wall, you stomp on it. You have to put it down as soon as it happens. Every time something happens, as leaders, we need to remember, if we don't say or do something, then we have set the standard by permitting it. So we have to make sure that we are setting the highest of standards in everything that we do. We have to ensure that. We also have to know our soldiers, because as somebody earlier said, some of these behaviors will occur, some of these harmful behaviors occur out of our sight as leaders. We don't see them happening. But if you see a soldier who is, they're not themselves, so you need to know them up front and say, you're not yourself. You're not, something is not right today. And then be able to sit with the soldier and say, what's wrong? Okay, I'm concerned. I care about you, and I'm concerned, and I want to help. And if they present, I'm having difficulty, this person is harassing me for dates, for an example, won't leave me alone, or keeps coming to my room in the barracks at night when I've told him to leave me alone. But you got to step in and do something about it. I'll take care of that. And usually a good sergeant telling a soldier, stop doing this behavior, that soldier's going to stop. They're going to start behaving. And take book of it, and if the soldier does it again, then you, of course, have to escalate. But know your soldiers. And if you know them and you see when something's wrong, you can see those behaviors. You can see, I'm having financial problems, or my grandmother has COVID and I'm worried about it. You understand those problems and those stressors that they're having to deal with, and you can, one, show them that you care, that leadership in your company, your battery, your troop cares, and that you will get them connected with the resources that they need to help them through their struggles. Be a compassionate leader, be an empathetic leader, take care of your soldiers, and also be a tough and demanding leader and set high standards. Those are not contradictory, they're not exclusive. You can be compassionate and empathetic and deeply caring about your soldiers, and at the same time, you can set high standards and high expectations in accordance with the Army values. And that's what we want to see in TIMS. That's what we want to see in all of our formations. And if our junior leaders are doing that, and if the leaders above them, the platoon sergeants, the first sergeants, the sergeants major, and the officer commanders are doing that, then we will eliminate these problems. The leadership will do better than any more engaged, compassionate leadership will do more than any program to make our Army a stronger force.
I'm certainly encouraged by the great participation and questions we got today, but your passion, Dr. Helis, and I'm sure glad we have you running this program to try to help us eliminate sexual harassment, sexual assault. The Army relies on cohesive teams of professionals, and you certainly cannot have that with sexual harassment, sexual assault in the ranks. So thanks for all you're doing. Thanks for all you'll do in the future. And thanks for taking so many questions. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I would just like to thank AUSA for the opportunity to talk today, and for the hundreds of members of the audience who have come in, and your great questions and your great interest and your great passion. I would say, let's just keep doing the right things. Let's live by the Army values. Let's take care of our soldiers, and let's set the standards for good order and discipline and enforce them. And also have to give a shout out to the great support team in the room. This has gone off from where I sit. This has gone off flawlessly. So thanks to all for this afternoon. I think this has been a great session. And again, what I would ask those who are engaged on the webinar this afternoon, go out and engage in your formations, at your installations, in your communities. Continue to spread the word.
It's great. Before we depart, I wanted to inform you of just a few upcoming events. Our next AUSA Noon Report will be on 12 April with Lieutenant General Scott Dingell, the 45th Surgeon General of the U.S. Army and Commanding General, U.S. Army Medical Command. And that event sponsored by Fluor. Our next AUSA Thought Leaders webinar will be on 20 April with General Retired George Jowen, author of Watchmen at the Gates, A Soldier's Journey from Berlin to Bosnia. On 4 May, we'll host another noon report with Lieutenant General Dan Karbler, Commanding General, United States Army Space and Missile Defense Command, and Joint Functional Component Command for Integrated Missile Defense. These are some great speakers, and we sure hope you can join us. For more information about any of these events or to register, please visit our website at ausa.org. Finally, we want to thank all of you who support us with your membership. Membership matters. You help us support the Army. Thank you again for attending, and have a great day.